Hi everyone. This is actually an optional lecture. You don't need to go through this. You can move on if you want. But for those who are interested, I want to, and there's been lots of questions about this, I want to explain the difference between LookML and SQL. Okay? So, first of all, SQL is a language that lets you access, retrieve, and manipulate data in a SQL-supported database. Okay? So if you have a database that has SQL, then you can use SQL to do lots of things to it. You can use SQL to retrieve data. You can use SQL to manipulate the data that's already in it. An example is on the right-hand side. We would use this, for example, to get the total sales by office. So we do select office, sum sales as total sales from the actual database, and we want to group the data by office. So this is something we would use again in code to sum up the sales by office. LookML is a language for describing dimensions, aggregations, calculations, and the data relationships in a SQL database. The difference here is that LookML itself is a language, but it's really used to write SQL queries against a database. Okay? So for example, LookML looks like this. We're creating a view called sales, where we get data from sales data, and we create a dimension called office, that's a string, and we create a measure called total sales, which is the sum of sales. Okay? Now, once LookML has this, it will take this and automatically construct this query. Now you might be saying, Henry, why would we need LookML in the first place? Well, and I get into this a lot more in the developer administrator course, but the big reason here is because you want to standardize this, right? You want the ability for someone to create these queries without having to know any code. So what a LookML person would do, for example, is they would create a measure called total sales, and then whenever a user or analyst uses total sales, in the background, a SQL query is constructed that has sum sales as total sales. But let's use a more complicated example. Let's say if we use something like net margin, right? The nice thing about doing LookML is you can create another measure called net margin, which can be the sum. And in the SQL, you would do sales minus cost minus taxes, for example, right? Now all the user would need to do is click net margin, and the underlying SQL query would update and say, okay, the user selected net margin, but what he actually wants is sales minus cost of goods minus taxes, right? So the user or analyst doesn't need to do that in their head. They don't need to pull in sales, then subtract cost of goods, then subtract taxes. They don't need to do that, right? Since it's defined in the LookML, all they need to do is get net margin, and LookML will look at that and say, okay, net margin actually means this, and construct the SQL query properly. That's why you don't need a aggregation layer or an ETL between your SQL database and your Looker environment, because you have LookML describing all of those things for you. Because in that example, what you would have to do then is you would need to basically create a table that sums up the data to a particular aggregation, and that creates a new column called net margin, right? But that's really annoying because then that person does not have access to the raw data anymore. This person only has access to a subset of the data, which is the ETL. Instead, you give your users access to the entire SQL database, but you create a LookML model that basically defines certain fields and logic for them. So they don't go crazy, and it constructs SQL queries in the background that actually make sense. And there we go. That's the difference between SQL and LookML. We go through a lot of this in a lot of detail in the developer and administrator section, or the developer and administrator course. Again, Looker is a It's actually pretty simple at the end of the day. It uses LookML to construct SQL queries against a particular database. Awesome.